Welcome to In the Shadow of Il Duce, a podcast on change and legacies in Italy. I am your host Diego, and in our second episode of a series we will cover the establishment of a dictatorship in Italy and the decay of Italian democracy. We begin our story 23 kilometers from Rome on the 16th of August 1924. In a shallow grave lies the body of Giacomo Matteotti, a socialist politician who 2 months earlier had given an impassioned speech denouncing the violence of fascism. 11 days later, he was last seen being bundled into a car with him desperately resisting. All fingers, and evidence, pointed to Mussolini and the wider fascist movement as the perpetrators of this brutal crime. Widespread protests and general strikes occurred, and a huge media storm was whipped up. At the same time, the radicals in his party had had enough. Fascism would either seize the monopoly of power, or Mussolini's head would roll. Mussolini was in a precarious situation, and yet on the 3rd of January 1925, an emboldened Mussolini stood in front of the Chambers of Deputies. He not only took responsibility for the full political, moral and historical responsibility for all that has happened, but for fascism and its violence. The mask had fallen. The long process of the normalization of violence and fascism had ended. The world would be exposed to fascism. In 48 hours, the situation would be clarified in every field, Mussolini said to vigorous applause, and cries of "Long live Mussolini." Italian democracy died as his final words were muttered. Despite becoming Prime Minister in October 1922, Mussolini's hold on power was precarious. He had only 3 other fascists in cabinet, and his party had won only 7% of the vote, with 35 out of over 530 deputies. Mussolini had little experience running a government, and fascism was seemingly going to follow the route of many liberal governments before it. To consolidate his power, Mussolini had to both woo the elite and maintain cohesion in an increasingly divided PNF, mainly by subverting the power of the radical squadristi. Mussolini decided on a course of normalization with the institutions of old, as he needed the support of the elite to gain legitimacy and power while ensuring the survival of his new regime. For example, he appointed Armando Diaz, the hero of Il Piave and Vittorio Veneto during the First World War, as Minister of War, a clear effort to try and reassure the elites of the country. Meanwhile, the PNF's merger with the Nationalists in 1923 helped dilute the radicalism within his own party, with an injection of monarchism and conservatism. In the short run, this helped Mussolini keep the radicals under control, but in the long run it led to the PNF slowly losing its innovative side, and harmed its ability to indoctrinate the population in the 1930s. These actions were carried out mainly due to the fascist takeover being a hybrid one. It was constituted of old elements of the political order and new fascist innovations, as fascism overlapped with parliamentary democracy. Fascism's rise to power had certainly subverted the old parliamentary system, but not eliminated it. Mussolini came to power through the king, and ruled using the old liberal institutions. This left no clear route to power for Mussolini. Was Mussolini even aiming for a one-party system? Or would he be content with a strong government, but one still compatible with parliament? Would fascism be conditioned by the old liberal institution to being a less radical movement? These questions reflected the deep rift between different factions of the PNF. In this period, 2 separate factions or groups began to form. The PNF was split between the normalizer faction and the radical faction. The normalizers or revisionists were a more moderate wing of the party. They argued for reform and normalization of the PNF into a respectable political entity within a strong state. The PNF should become the organization in which new managerial and technocratic elites were born. They argued for the formation of gruppi di competenza, or technical study groups. They were envisioned not only as think tanks, but also as the embodiment and the vanguard of constitutional change. They would act as a political powerhouse, leading reform in a heavily modified, but not completely sidelined parliamentary system. The normalizers both benefited and welcomed the PNF's merger with the Nationalists, as they saw the merger as an injection of talent into the party. The radicals, a loose group of squadristi and syndicalists who instead argued for a revolution, rejected these ideas strongly. They aimed to spread and perfect decentralized tyrannies through which they would control all levels of local and provincial life. The new elite would be the elite of the revolution, who would legalize fascist illegality, as Farinacci, the brutal and insane Raz of Cremona put it. This would entail the annihilation of the opposition, any checks and balances of fascist violence, and the changing of the status quo in the economic and political world. They saw the PNF taking over the role of the state and its institutions rather than reforming them to the fascist image. The factionalism in the PNF and the relative power of the provincials meant that whatever path Mussolini chose, he still had to answer their concerns. The normalization path had angered many squadristi who believed that Mussolini, by flirting with the establishment, was betraying the revolution. Thus, to prevent any more revolts and consolidate his power, Mussolini appeased them without giving them really any real power. He created the fascist militia, or the MVSN, which were recruited from old squadristi. They, however, answered to Il Duce, completely bypassing the RAS, thus subverting provincial power. A Grand Council of fascists were created, and whilst it did have considerable power, it still served more to give party leaders a sense of importance. Mussolini's attempts in placating the radicals may have made them feel better about themselves, but it didn't reverse the fact that the March on Rome had been a disaster for the squadristi, who in a changing party had begun to lose their influence. The reform and the brief period of normalization served to undermine the party as a potential key institution in fascist Italy, as the radicals had envisioned. This would have catastrophic consequences for the survival of their regime. Despite Mussolini and fascism coming to power through compromise with the country's existing political institution, fascism was still, however, heading in a dictatorial direction. Fascism had embedded itself into the system, and just like it had done to the red heart of Italy with the squadristi, fascism would kill Italian democracy from the inside, like an undiscovered tumour. Yes, the Grand Council may have been relatively powerless compared to the state, but it still formulated the main lines of fascist policy, and it helped to coordinate state and party. For example, it took unconstitutional decisions outside of parliament, such as giving Mussolini the king's prerogative to choose the date of elections. It served as a fascist cabinet outside of democratic institutions, answering to nobody but fascism and Mussolini. The fascist militia acted as a legal private army for Mussolini, suppressing opposition through intimidation and violence, and by preventing equal and free political competition. Unlike the Regio Esercito, or the Royal Italian Army, the militia answered to Mussolini only, and not the king. These institutions were clearly non-democratic, and served only the purpose of eating Italian democracy from the inside out. However, the greatest tool used to break the back of democracy was the Acerbo Law of 1923. This law marked the true end of the parliamentary system, even if it lived on in name. Mussolini was still in a quite weak position, unable to be dismissed at any moment. He needed a majority of fascist MPs, and so he changed the electoral system by replacing the proportional representation system with a new one. This system allowed the party with the largest number of votes to take 2/3 of the seats, a clear breach of every basic democratic principle. The 1924 election showed the true colours of fascism. Violence was used extensively. By mixing violence and the threat of violence, fascism was able to slowly unravel Italian democracy. In the 1924 election, they killed one socialist candidate, suppressed meetings, and attacked opposition voters. The RAS were allowed a free hand to intimidate opponents, while several fascists were allowed to vote several times over. The results won't surprise you. The fascists won over 275 deputies, while the socialists and Catholics were reduced to under 50 deputies. The fascists had won the control of the state. The assassination of Matteotti, despite causing a crisis which was a serious threat to Mussolini's power, also exposed the extent to which fascism had rotted not only the Italian political system, but the entirety of Italian civil society. Despite cries and calls for Mussolini's resignation and removal, despite the damning evidence of the Rossi report which directly implicated Mussolini, nothing was done. The influence of fascism had corrupted the elite, and the king refused to act. Normalization would have many legacies. The process of normalization and dictatorship by stealth also had a significant legacy for the PNF and its effectiveness. The brief period of normalization had weakened the radicals within the PNF. Although still powerful, they had been sidelined and their dreams of revolution shattered. The PNF would be under the state from now on. Fascism had been diluted. The regime that was born was not one of fascist revolutionaries, but one of Mussolini. However, the greatest and clearest legacy is the destruction of Italian civil society. Fascism was allowed to corrupt Italy and change it to its will without political interference. Italian democracy had died. The post-World War II architects would have to build and create an entirely new Italy and system with no long-standing traditions of democracy, at least in the recent past. The republic that was born out of the ashes of fascism would be based on these weak and brittle foundations rotted out by fascism.